It was late morning by the time I finally humped into Camp 3, a trio of small yellow tents, halfway up the vertiginous sprawl of the Lhotse face, jammed side by side onto a platform that had been hewn from the icy slope by our Sherpas. When I arrived, Lakpa-Chiri and Arita were still hard at work on a platform for a fourth tent, so I took off my pack and helped them chop. At 24,000 feet, I could manage only 7 or 8 blows of my ice axe before having to pause for more than a minute to catch my breath. My contribution to the effort was negligible, needless to say, and it took nearly an hour to complete the job. Our tiny camp, 100 feet above the tents of the other expeditions, was a spectacularly exposed perch. For weeks we'd been toiling in what amounted to a canyon. Now, for the first time on the expedition, the vista was primarily sky rather than earth. Herds of puffy cumulus raced beneath the sun, imprinting the landscape with a shifting matrix of shadow and blinding light. Waiting for my teammates to arrive, I sat with my feet hanging over the abyss, staring across the clouds, looking down on the tops of 22,000-foot peaks that a month earlier had towered overhead. At long last, it seemed as though I was really nearing the roof of the world. The summit, however, was still a vertical mile above, wreathed in a nimbus of gale-borne condensation. But even as the upper mountain was raked by winds in excess of 100 miles per hour, the air at Camp 3 barely stirred, and as the afternoon wore on, I began to feel increasingly woozy from the fierce solar radiation. At least I hoped it was the heat that was making me stupid, and not the onset of cerebral edema. High-altitude cerebral edema is less common than high-altitude pulmonary edema, but it tends to be even more deadly. A baffling ailment, HACE, occurs when fluid leaks from oxygen-starved cerebral blood vessels, causing severe swelling of the brain, and it can strike with little or no warning. As pressure builds inside the skull, motor and mental skills deteriorate with alarming speed, typically within a few hours or less, and often without the victim even noticing the change. The next step is coma, and then, unless the afflicted party is quickly evacuated to lower altitude, death. HACE happened to be on my mind that afternoon because just 2 days earlier, a client of Fisher's named Dale Cruz, a 44-year-old dentist from Colorado, had come down with a serious case of it right here at Camp 3. A longtime friend of Fisher's, Cruz was a strong, very experienced climber. On April 26th, he'd climbed from Camp 2 to Camp 3, brewed some tea for himself and his teammates, and then lay down in his tent to take a nap. I fell right asleep, Cruz recalls, and ended up sleeping almost 24 hours until about 2 p.m. the following day. When somebody finally woke me up, it immediately became apparent to the others that my mind wasn't working, although it wasn't apparent to me. Scott told me, "We gotta get you down right away." Cruz was having an incredibly difficult time simply trying to dress himself. He put his climbing harness on inside out, threaded it through the fly of his windsuit, and failed to fasten the buckle. Fortunately, Fisher and Neil Beidelman noticed the screw-up before Cruz started to descend. If he'd tried to rappel down the ropes like that, says Beidelman, he would have immediately popped out of his harness and fallen to the bottom of the Lhotse face. It was like I was very drunk, Cruz recollects. I couldn't walk without stumbling, and completely lost the ability to think or speak. It was a really strange feeling. I'd have some word in my mind, but I couldn't figure out how to bring it to my lips. So Scott and Neil had to get me dressed and make sure my harness was on correctly. Then Scott lowered me down the fixed ropes. By the time Cruz arrived in base camp, he says, it was still another 3 or 4 days before I could walk from my tent to the mess tent without stumbling all over the place.